Great. Thank you, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, Andy. And just to flag that, I mean, two things. The one is that this is ongoing work. So we're very interested if you have comments, criticisms, solutions to the very many complexities that we see that we're still trying to figure out how to theorize. So that would be really interesting. And the other is that one of my two co-authors in this work is here today, and that's Linda Weidenstedt. Yeah, so it's great working with her. And then the other is Andrea Giesinger, who I'm of course probably mispronouncing her German last name because I don't speak German, but she's not here to hear it. So we'll just, you don't hear it, it didn't happen, sort of thing. So the case that we're looking at here is that of gig work, which we know quite a lot about already, and that there's been quite extensive research looking at the conditions of gig workers, looking at the role of platforms in gig work, and looking at the use of algorithms in gig work. But we're also very interested here in the platforms themselves and the situations that they find themselves in. And there's a couple of reasons why this is interesting. The one is just that platform organizing is increasingly starting to be seen as an alternative to market-based organizing and firm-based organizing. So you have all of these, the reason that firms exist is as a counterpoint to markets because there's sort of reduced transaction costs associated with being firms. And now you have the introduction of platforms, and platforms in this kind of transaction economics lens can do a whole lot of things more efficiently than even the firm, and still have something approaching more competition, as you would see in the market. So there's this alternative paradigm that is starting to be explored. So that's the one thing. And the other reason that platforms and gig work platforms in particular are quite interesting is because they are themselves this kind of entrepreneurial force. So some of them are really quite advanced, like the Mechanical Turks and the Ubers of the world, and some of them, particularly here in Sweden, the entrepreneurship in the space that they find themselves in is a lot sort of more early stage, and they're a great example of what I'll later call liminal entrepreneurship, which is entrepreneurship that occurs in this kind of in-between space where you don't really know what the rules are yet. And the crucial thing being yet, because it's by definition an in-between space. And so there's a perceived opportunity to create value, but it's also a kind of scary space in which to create value, precisely because you don't know what the rules down the line will be. And that is very much the case here in Sweden, even though elsewhere in the world we're starting to see that authorities in particular are coming down on particular sides of regulatory debates about what it is exactly that platforms, or rather platform owners, what their role is in relation to work. So here we see gig work platforms as kind of traditional platforms where they perform a matching role. They often, although not always, use algorithms to match. And the thing about liminality, which is this in-betweenness, but it's also a nothingness. It's not clear whether they are employers or neutral mediators. And so it's this kind of Schrödinger cat. You are at the same time both an employer and a mediator because you don't know really which hat to wear, and so you wear both, this kind of thing. And so in Sweden, it's also particularly interesting context-wise because you have very established rules and norms around employment. You have very, very powerful unions, and you also have a kind of government that is very pro-unions and pro-protections for workers. So one could go down a kind of legal line of reasoning, but I won't here. But I think that's, yeah, it's fairly well established there. And so what results very much for these platforms is what we here call a role conflict. So on the one hand, they're a platform, they're an entrepreneur. They have day-to-day operations, not day-to-do operations, but day-to-day operations as platform owners, where they have to match and match employers and employees, or wrong word, employers and workers, at come any cost. And so they have to really focus on this. And this is their primary initiative and their primary role as entrepreneurs. But by virtue of the fact that they find themselves in this in-between state, they don't know how to proceed. They don't know whether they should behave as though they are an employer or as though they are a neutral intermediary. And this is particularly unclear in the Swedish context, and they don't know what will happen in Sweden relative to the rest of the world, how that particular penny will drop. And I think that this kind of combination of the digital presence and the real world presence is really interesting in an information systems and a digital artifact sort of context, because we see this again and again. You see that communities online often are still very much anchored in the real world in which they find themselves, and this is particularly true of entrepreneurs. Even so they have this kind of double presence, and two hats. And I don't know how many of you speak Swedish, but these are some quotes from our data collection that I think are really just interesting in terms of giving voice to actual gig workers, but also to really present the ambiguity here, because we're quite well familiar with the argument that platforms should behave as employers and have quite a lot of control over their employees, or rather over workers. And so that language is quite dominant. But during our data collection, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, we actually see that the gig workers, even though they use platforms, are making an active choice and actually have other alternatives and don't see themselves as being in an employer-employee relationship. So the one in the gray bubble here, and I'm sort of loosely translating to English, it gives me the freedom to take a job when it suits me. I've done this since I was in high school as an extra source of income and to get extra experience in a whole lot of different kinds of professions. I became a gig worker because it's flexible while in studies. So that's the one thing. So it's about choice. It's about experience in different professions or different areas, and it's also about flexibility, and those are themes that come up again and again from gig workers, and we have sort of parallel projects that look specifically at the individuals rather than the platforms, but I bring it up here just as part of the interesting context. And then the other comment, which is the kind of turquoise bubble there, is it says, this is why I don't want to be full-time employed at one company. I can do so many things, or rather I know so many things. I don't want to lock myself in. I instead want to help many with the competence that I'm sitting on. And I think it's by no means the only view of gig work, but I think is a particularly illuminatory view, and a nice kind of juxtaposition to the kind of exploitative view that we often see, and is often kind of promoted when one has a discussion about whether gig work platforms should be seen as employers or as neutral intermediaries. And so what we study here are two, not just platform organizations, but meta organizations, which include platforms and other actors. And so the one is a trade organization that represents the platforms. So there are a number of platforms that have come together to form a trade organization. And the second meta organization is a policy lab, which includes a number of stakeholders, including the platforms, but also state agencies, gig workers, researchers, in other words, us. So these two different sorts of meta organizations. And as the title of this presentation suggests, we're then looking at having identified this role conflict, how does the existence and the functions of these meta-organizations help them to make sense, but also hopefully even to overcome the role conflict that they find themselves in. And so here's a little bit about the data. And so I've done an unconventional thing here where I've introduced you to the case before introducing the theory. So I'm now going to go on and introduce the theory and talk a little bit about more about liminality and a little bit more just about the kind of theoretical background here. Because I think, you know, one talks about papers as being phenomenon first or theory first. And I think at my heart of hearts, I think of this as being a phenomenon first because I just think it's very interesting. But of course, the theory is an important counterpoint to help us understand what it is that we're seeing. So the first of these is what is liminality, and so far I've described it as this kind of state of in-betweenness, and I just want to build on that a little bit. So it's a kind of structural temporal space that exists as a kind of passage from one state to another. So if you have a kind of before state and an in-between state and an after state, so you're going from one stage to another. Liminality is this kind of in-betweenness, and it exists in time, so it's finite. It doesn't necessarily carry on forever, although there are cases in which it sort of carries on for as long as one can remember, but one sort of expects it to at some point come to an end, and also that it's structural and it has implications for roles, it has implications for status and similar. So the actors have neither the characteristics of being in the first category nor the characteristics of being in the latter category. So they're very much stuck in between, and are sort of betwixt in between. And often it's quite frightening. I mean, if you think of, you know, kind of children on the playground, you go into a field or a space, and not knowing what the rules are, you don't know what it is that you should do. You don't know how it is that you should behave. You don't know, as an individual actor or as an organizational actor, where it is that you sit on the pecking order, how you should adapt your behavior. So on the one hand, it's very scary, but on the other hand, as I said a little bit earlier, it's kind of, excuse me, Schrodinger's cat-y. It could resolve in any number of ways. It could be that this liminal space resolves in kind of way A or in way B, and while you're sitting in that liminal space, you don't actually know which it is that it will be, which is precisely why it's kind of the suspension of all of this. It's also been called a kind of void, which I think is pretty accurate and pretty interesting. And the liminal entrepreneurship literature, which is also just starting to come out, and which we see very much the emergence of platforms, and particularly gig work platforms, as operating in, is where entrepreneurs emerge exactly because there is this ambiguous space, right? And so they're not sure what it is that the rules will be, but they see that there is a massive social change going on, and so they move into that space, and it could go any number of ways, and they so that's one way. Where rules are unclear, but there's a second way in which entrepreneurship could be seen as liminal, and that is just being entrepreneurs themselves, where, you know, this kind of links to institutional entrepreneurship literature. The entrepreneur themselves often is active in kind of changing how it is that things are going to happen or going to be, and so they're in this liminal space between being, you know, venture absence and venture profitable, or certainty, or exit, or whatever you want to call it, and then there are also kind of cognitive angles to this as well in the entrepreneurship space. Liminality can also be associated with particular roles, and so this is where we sort of dive in, where what is the role of the platform. And in the past, you know, temporary workers have been identified as having this liminal state. Consultants have been identified as having this liminal state. And of course, this is interesting because gig workers themselves perhaps could be described as liminal, even if that's not the focus of our attention here. And so we see that this liminality, precisely because one doesn't know what it is that is going to happen and how liminality will resolve itself, means that platforms don't know what role they have and consequently which behaviors they should engage with. So in this case, so here definitions of role conflict: a conflict between one or several roles for the same actor, which require different or incompatible behaviors. So here for the gig work platform, different and incompatible behaviors being, on the one hand, is the platform an employer, and should they enter into collective agreements? Should they be paying taxes for their employees? Should they have all of the responsibilities that comes with being an employer in the Swedish state, on the one hand? Or, and that's quite a huge responsibility and really will affect their work. Or, on the other hand, are they a neutral intermediary with a completely different sets of behaviors where their focus should be on not on worker well-being, but rather on maximizing the number of transactions on the platform that can occur. And so they need to find a way to reconcile these two role conflicts. And for individual entrepreneurs, as in the case of these platform owners, it's really stressful to be in this position because they don't know how to proceed. And it's not uncommon to see this kind of role conflict in a liminal space, precisely because one doesn't know what to expect or what the next space will be. And so the novel thing that these particular platform owners then decided to do is engage in meta-organizing. And as I said earlier, we look then at two meta-organizations, one which they initiated and one initiated by others also in the liminal space who they then engaged with. And so meta-organizations are kind of organizations, but without many of the trappings of firms. So there's no employment relationship, there's very little control over the individuals in the meta-organization, although they have a shared system level goal that they're working towards. So meta-organizing becomes this, rather than in contrast to the meta-organization, meta-organizing is the kind of process of maneuvering or pursuing system-level goals through a loosely coupled organization of multilateral relationships, but without formal authority. So that's sort of what we see. And now moving on to sort of our findings. What we see through the creation of these meta-organizations and the meta-organizing is that the platform organizations or the platform owners start to create a separate kind of liminality, right? Which is not just circumstantial. It's not just they happen to be in this liminal space where there are massive social changes going on that they happen to be part of, but rather that they're in a liminal space where they're sort of redirecting attention. So it's not clear where things will go yet, but they're trying to behave constructively in that space, not just kind of be stuck in the fear of it and trying to figure out how to move forward. So there's a very kind of deliberate construction of that liminal space where there's an acknowledgement that they are neither employer nor intermediary, but also that this liminal space needs to be explored in order to support kind of a way forward. So these two kinds of liminal spaces, but then also for those platform owners, by creating the meta-organization, to step out of the role of being platform owners, so that they're sort of betwixt and between themselves, that they don't have to always represent the interest of the platform owner, and they don't always have to pursue the role and the activities associated with being a platform owner. So they can start to resolve the role conflict by having a fictional separation of the two roles, the one on the one hand where they're supposed to be matching, and the other on the other hand where they're trying to make sense of how it is that this kind of big social change or liminal space will resolve itself. and then starting to unpack this deliberate liminality, and this is where we're sitting now, is to see what the characteristics of this deliberate liminality are. The first is where you see the deliberate suspension of hierarchies, and so precisely because the choice of these meta-organizations as a vehicle is precisely because one goes into meta-organizations and one meta-organizes with the intention of everybody coming to that meeting space together, right? So the fact, so it reinforces the liminality by making everybody equal, which of course they aren't in any of the resolved states. So from meta-organization case 2, participants were very careful to say that these are my experiences, and they didn't want to claim anything about anybody else. And so that was very, very useful in terms of occupying that liminal space and yeah, just moving forward in a sort of neutral way. But then also, you know, when there are not only no human hierarchies between individuals, they also aren't social hierarchies, right? So the social contract or the social welfare system in the kind of country suddenly becomes fair game, even though we're comprised of a whole lot of individuals who have no real impact on what it is that the social safety net should look like. We nevertheless say, okay, well, if everything is equal, if there are no hierarchies, we can start to say that maybe it is not the platforms who should change. Maybe it is not the gig workers who should change their behavior. Maybe there's something wrong with the system, with the whole context in which we find ourselves. And if that is so, how do we go about changing it? And so that's sort of a flip on the debate which you typically see, which is very much about situating the platform in its context, rather than seeing if the context should maybe move or adjust to accommodate the platform. But then we also see that the platform, that these meta-organizations allow an orientation of the debate to start discussing what the possibilities might be in order to move out of the liminal state, and to do it in this neutral way. And so here they start to, and this is in meta-organization 1, start to distinguish themselves from what they see as the other, the kind of pre-liminal state, right? The ones that they see of not being unclear anymore. So Uber, for example, which has a particular pattern of interaction with their workers that you don't see on all gig work platforms, they start to distinguish themselves from that and reinforce the liminality in that way. And then saying, you know, we are not like them. This is one possibility. We have all of these responsibilities. The question is about how to fulfill those responsibilities. So whether it's around employment or whether it's about some other alternative that we haven't discussed yet. And then given that there is this neutral space where you can take deliberate steps forward, how do we go about that? Let's discuss some of the possibilities, and so a renegotiation of normative next steps in this space where hierarchies don't apply, and some of those next steps are very social. So about saying, you know, let's just make this make sense. Let's figure out how to get it all to work for everyone. And so this quote came from meta-organization 1, just sort of saying that this is a factual reality, that people are engaged in this kind of work, and so maybe the structures need to enable that, rather than to try and make work fit into the structures, because clearly the structures are aligned with some pre-change kind of way of thinking. And some other things that they discussed as being very important way forwards is to step out of this kind of idea that platforms are either employers or intermediaries, and the idea that platforms have a lot of control over their workers, and say, well, actually maybe there are ways in which this control could be reduced. And one really important way that comes up again and again is data portability, where there's some sort of lock-in in the platform that technologically could be changed, and this would also change the power dynamics and contribute to some sort of resolution of the liminality. And even as they recognize that, they reinforce that the absence of having all of these things means that we stay in this liminal state that could still go either way, but that we're engaging in and trying to make sense of. So that's very much where we are at the moment, where we see this reinforcement of liminality and a choice of, rather than circumstantial liminality, deliberate liminality, where this in-betweenness is reiterated in many ways in order to help the actors make sense, but also to allow the platform owners to make sense, or rather to resolve the role conflict that they found themselves in, both on the short term by separating out the organization and the meta organization, but also with an eye to the future to kind of obtain the information and situate themselves in a neutral way in some sort of hierarchy-less debate to make sense of the world moving forward. So this particular paper project fits into kind of a number of larger projects that some of which I am working on alone, and some together with Linda and Andrea, who I mentioned earlier. And the first is a system level evaluation of gig work in Sweden, because Sweden and Scandinavia have quite particular attitudes both to digitalization and to work. How is it then that we make sense of this platform mediated form of work in this particular context? The second is the phenomenon of meta-organizing, which is something that is increasing the interest for scholars of platform organizing or platform ecosystems. And the last is then to explore this notion of the platform organizing logic. Yeah, so just to reiterate those kind of tentative theoretical findings or kind of, yeah, liminal findings, is to kind of reiterate that here in this liminal space, whoopsie, it didn't quite work out as planned. There's supposed to be another box around circumstantial, but it seems to have run away. But really to be able to separate out this liminality between the circumstantial and the deliberate as a way for them to help them navigate the in-betweenness in which they find themselves. Yeah, questions, comments, things that didn't make sense. Thank you for listening.